Instead, we have the opportunity to make a habit of empathy, to recognize ourselves in each other.
You have to come up, okay.
There's only one microphone. Okay. Is this one working now?
This working? Yes. I'm going to read my question because I'm not as good as you are. I really liked your book, but I'm not convinced that your evolutionary model of consciousness really does justice to the gathering and hunting peoples, and it leads us in a different direction. For example, it seems to me you emphasize primarily quantity of empathy, and that has grown over time. I agree completely. But there's also quality, that from a gatherer-hunter society perspective, our society is autistic to the non-human world. They have a heck of a lot more empathy at that level. And only some environmentalists are really beginning to explore that, and some people in spiritual communities. It also, from a hunter-gatherer perspective, it's anything, they frequently initiate outsiders who are outside of the tribe, outside of the bloodline. There's a long history of that. So they're not quite so narrow as I think you suggest. It takes anything but a primitive awareness to handle the rugged kinds of environments that they've been pretty much pushed to these days. So I want to suggest that maybe qualitativeness is equally important, and that what might be happening is that different kinds of societies offer sort of different centers of gravity around which our empathy can manifest. And within that context, I think you've done an absolutely fantastic job.
Well, let me say, I've gotten this response a few times, and I have to say I respectfully but deeply disagree. But you're not the first one that said this about this in the last few weeks. But let me explain this very quickly, but you know, I did it more so in the book. During the Romantic period of the 19th century, Rousseau, the grandfather of the Romantic period, and then the Romantics, the great poets and those of literature and philosophy, they were trying to counter the rationalists, and they gave a great deal of credence to our primitive ancestors, the indigenous people, saying we need to get back to that state of nature. We need to find our innocence, our purity. We have a strain of that within the most liberal and progressive societies today, that we need to get back to what our Indian forebears or what natives in various countries have done way back when. I'm going to have to say to you that's a different sensibility. And that is that in order to actually experience deeply, not quantitatively, empathy, it requires a more and more of a sense of one's separation from the collective we, a sense of one's individual selfhood, but also then that self by empathy, begins to reassociate not by blood ties, but by humanity ties. A forager-hunter society, there's no I. Every hunter society in history, the forager-hunters, it was only a we. There's no sense of I. Does not exist. There may be a limited sense of selfhood, but in those societies there was no sense of birth and death. They didn't know where babies came from. They thought the spirits put the baby in you, and then there are a series of passages into society. Then when you die, you don't die. You go to sleep, and in the netherworld, and this is in every forager-hunter society, and then you could come back as a spirit, as a rock or a star or something else. This was all forager-hunter societies. Their conscious level of individuality was below what an 8 or 9-year-old would be today who knows about birth and death. Until one has a developed sense of selfhood and a sense of their own fragility, their mortality, their one and only life, it's hard to then express that empathy in a deep way for someone else's one and only life. And then to say, reassociate based on one's sense of one's mortality and one's life journey with someone else. That doesn't mean that indigenous societies don't feel empathic distress. Our chimpanzee brothers and sisters, we share 98% of our genes, they have a consciousness of a 2.5 to 3-year-old child. They pass the self-reflection test in the mirror, as do elephants. They do feel empathic distress, so do elephants. They do have rudimentary culture. But until one has a sense of one's life, where birth comes from, and especially death, and a one and only existence, one can't mature empathy. Empathy, that's why it's a very complex, unutopian term. So I have to respectfully disagree. That doesn't mean that forager and hunters aren't living low on the food chain, etc. But I think we've over-romanticized them if it's from an empathic perspective.